okay? So photography is looming in the wings at the beginning of the 19th century. It's clear that something is going to happen. All sorts of people are trying to figure out mechanical ways of making pictures. And I couldn't resist putting 3 or 4 examples of mechanical ways of making pictures in the exhibition that just precede photography. The first one I did here is a black and white chromolithograph. You hardly ever find them. But it clearly was made from a painting. It's a ghastly picture. But it's interesting because the person making the print has decided that the picture is made of a black, dark brown, lighter brown, and then finally a light gray. And they've made manual separation to try to replicate the tone of the picture. This is like a very refined version of the aquatint making a truly ugly picture. It's truly awful. This is a rubbing. A rubbing is a mechanical system of making pictures. We probably all made rubbings. People travel to Europe and make them of the brass engravings in the cathedrals. This is one of an 18th century tombstone my old man made in the 30s. But it's an interesting idea. If you have a relief carving or something with relief information, you can put a piece of paper on, rub it with something like graphite, pull it off, and you get a picture. And the hand didn't have to make the picture. It's a mechanical system for transcribing a picture. This is a pantograph etching. This is a kooky, crazy thing that came along in the beginning of the 19th century. This is an enlargement of it. It's absolutely fascinating. It's a system for mechanically translating a relief metal medallion into a print. And I've seen half a dozen examples of it, and this is a particularly fascinating one because it's somebody who's raving about his process being better than somebody else's process. But the principle behind it is that if you get a medallion, let's say the medallion is this big, and it has a relief image of somebody on it, you can get a specialized pantograph, and as the pantograph traces the figure and goes up and down, it inscribes an etched line in an etching ground and changes the spacing of the line this way according to the relief of the metal this way. So the pantograph is made to run parallel lines, and as it runs each parallel line, as it does this, the line does this. And by then etching the plate and printing it, we have lines which all get squished over to make a dark and make a light value when they squish over. And we can see it here. It's really quite unbelievable. Here it's light because the lines have been pushed down to make the nose. Look at this beautiful progression. There's no possible way the hand could have made this. The pantograph made it. The hand made the metal in the first place. So the information came from the mind of the artist onto the medallion, and then it went from the mind of the pantograph onto the etching plate, and from the mind of the plate onto the paper. But there's something very cool in this print that we only can see in the enlargement. When we have an etching or an engraving, we have to wipe it by hand. You remember I said about putting the ink on and wiping it with cloth. And when we wipe it by hand, if the lines get too close together, then when we etch them, the place between them is etched away. And if the place between them is etched away, the hand goes down in and takes some of the ink out. This original surface that the hand runs across, I call the wiping guide. There's no problem when the hand is wiping this part because the hand runs along the white, which is the unetched top of the plate. But when it gets down in here, the lines are too close and it starts to dip in. So see how it gets light here? That little bit of lightness and the little bit of lightness under the nose is the undercutting of the wiping guide, and it's a lightness that happens in the wiping of the plate. And it's the great bugaboo that chases after us. Every time we make a photogravure, we battle with the fact that when we get a beautiful black, we're right on the edge of losing the wiping guide. And when we print a halftone, we're right on the edge of losing the shadow detail just when we get the beautiful black because we fill in the white dot that is the offsets version of the wiping guide. So this is a physical problem. If we want to get a beautiful black, we stand on the edge of disaster. And we can really see it in this print. This print is also fascinating because if you look at the fineness of the vertical lines when we take a break, I know none of you are doing this when we take a break, are you? Maybe you will next break. The fineness of the lines is absolutely incredible. That's because they had a ruling engine that the pantograph was connected to, and the ruling engine was a machine that was invented for making diffraction gratings for astronomy. So they had this beautiful device around that could rule perfect parallel lines. It's what made the first halftones, and we see it at work here on this. This is a screaming piece of paper because, let me see does he write it on the bottom? He says, mathematically accurate answer to Mr. Bates's challenge. This is a pantograph system developed by a guy named Akil Kola, and he makes some prints with it, and Mr. Bates in a different publication has said Kola's process stinks. It's not accurate. And he's made this sheet to show this extraordinary rendition of this medallion. Then he's changed the pivot points on the pantograph, made a bunch of samples where he changes the point of view of the medallion by changing the location of the pivots. So there's all these distorted versions. It's absolutely incredible. So really make a point of looking at them. You just can't believe anybody has done anything as nutty as this. And this little bit here is made from this one in the middle. What is it?
What year was that done?
That was probably done, I think that's just before photography. That's probably, well, maybe I'll look at the label. Maybe the label says. I'm going to say 1830, 1837. Isn't it interesting, 2 years before photography? But again, it's this effort to make a mechanically generated picture. Okay. Then the last thing before we talk about photography is the silhouette. And the silhouette is an incredible thing. And there's two different kinds of silhouettes, and we're lucky enough to have both kinds here on the show. The first kind is this big one on the wall. I have a whole stack of these because my family has obsessively made them since the 18th century. And the way this was made, probably, is the person who was going to be silhouetted would sit in a chair like this, and there would be a piece of paper on the wall, and they would probably have a book or something like this they'd lean against. This is your shadow, right? And they lean against it, and the book would hold the paper and keep them from jiggling, and across the room would be a candle. And the candle would cast a shadow of the profile, and somebody would get a pencil and draw the outline of the shadow. And it would make this beautiful linear outline, and then somebody with a pair of scissors would cut it out. This one was cut out by Anna Wharton, who signed at AEW. Anna Wharton is the sister of the lady who did the handwriting in two directions in the other room. And in fact, we even have, we have a daguerreotype cover in the book, not here. These things were made at parties. And you'd go to a party, and after everybody got half in the bag, they'd sit around and they'd make silhouettes of each other. And you'd go home with silhouettes. And we even have them of couples, where one person in the couple has sat and had theirs drawn, and then the other person has come and they move the piece of paper a little bit. So the two heads are like this, you know. The hand slavishly followed the pencil outline, but the transcription of the image is mechanical. There's a whole other kind of silhouette, which is in the little book that's sitting here. The silhouettes were a favorite of Quakers. Somehow they wanted to have pictures, but they felt everything should be kind of plain. So they didn't want to have fancy miniatures and things. Two of these little booklets came down in my family. This is one of 18th century silhouettes that were put together in the 19th century into this album. They were made with a machine. And the machine was called something like a physiognomograph or something like that. And the person having the thing made would sit like this, and this machine had a brass rod, and the brass rod would trace the profile like this, and as it traced it, a pantograph would make a 1/6 reduced drawing with a stylus on a piece of paper. And the piece of paper then could be folded once and twice, and somebody with scissors or a knife would cut out the figure. And then in some of them, there's a beautiful little lock of hair that's clearly put in later that wasn't something that really turned out from the tracing, but was added later. They really and truly are photographs. They're light describing an image. They really are your shadow, right? And they're a semi-mechanical system of preserving that shadow. These little silhouettes were made in the Peel Museum. And it's very interesting because every time you cut one of these figures out, you have the thing you cut out. It's called the deadhead. And all the silhouettes made in the Peel Museum were made by a black man who was first a slave, who then bought his freedom with the money he earned cutting the silhouettes and stayed there cutting them. And they said he used to have a barrel with all the deadheads in it. So he had George Washington, he had Thomas Jefferson, he had all the founding fathers in this bucket. And in this album, occasionally you'll turn a page and find a deadhead stuck in there. It's very interesting. So these really are the most direct antecedent of the photograph that I'm aware of. Now I'll tell you a story about the album, and then we'll take a little break and we'll move into photography. But the story is that there were 2 of these albums, and I had a hysterical aunt who had one of them, much the most beautiful album, one rich blue paper, the blue of your scarf, you know, where the silhouettes were against it, a French blue paper. It was absolutely beautiful. And she was hysterical, and I tried to borrow it to copy it, to photocopy it before photography. She said, "Oh, you can't possibly have it." And she threw it away at one point, and it disappeared, gone forever. But this one turned out to be in a drawer of a chest of drawers in my cousin's house. And they both come down from the same time period. And in this house, in the 18th century, there was a gloriously beautiful young woman who was named Molly Robinson. She was meant to be the prettiest girl in Newport at the time of the Revolution. And of course, the British occupied Newport. And she fell in love with a British soldier. His name was Thomas Parton. Listen, I'm way off the line here. I don't know why we're videoing this. We're going to do it anyway, right? And of course, the parents were appalled that this would happen. And they immediately shipped Molly Robinson off to the other side of the bay, over to Narragansett, and kept her there for the duration of the war to keep her away from Thomas Parton. But it turned out that she was in Philadelphia at one point, and they had a party, and Parton snuck across the lines, and they had their silhouettes made. And there's a silhouette of him and her that exists. And so what happened is, he then went and was killed at Yorktown. And the family managed to keep her from doing anything. And she, much later on, married John Morton, who was an older man, and they produced one child from whom I'm descended, which is why I know this whole story, why the album exists, why we have the album. And Molly Robinson's granddaughter put the album together when she was a young girl under the direction of Molly, who then was in her 80s. And when they assembled the album, the first page, which we can't see because it isn't turned on it, is the British soldier and her favorite brother together. And then you turn the page and it's her and the old man, which is the page we're seeing here. But I'll get in just a sec. But it's interesting, it's an absolute connection to the reality of the past through these pictures. And when the hysterical aunt had her album out and she and my mother and I were looking at it, it had no names written in it. And they could recognize all the people from their profiles from the 18th century because they were so much embedded in the family. So it's photography. It's real photography early on. Yes, sorry, story ended.
Listening to you talk this morning made me wonder about the role of women played in the whole notion of introducing color to the world at the time. Probably men were more involved in the mechanical processes, i.e. that they were putting on rouge, they were brushing on blue eyeliner, they were using black to highlight, the sense of line. A lot of the same things you described going on plates went on skin. I often felt that some of the early chromolithographs had that feeling almost of, they were like makeup being applied to it.
Yeah, I don't.
Have you ever thought about that?
I've thought about, the only way I've thought about it is I've thought about makeup being one of the basic fundamental systems of communication. And when I've tried to make a taxonomy of tools, and in the pictorial category of the taxonomy, makeup is a big deal because it's a pictorial system by which we communicate, just like a painting or just like a drawing. But I haven't ever thought of it in terms of, I think a lot of the color printing came from painting.
But you also use brushes, you use wipes.
You do.
Things you've been describing today just struck me today.
But the engravings and the chromolithographs virtually always are of paintings. And I think we have a vision of this drab pictorial world, but the paintings were the greatest paintings ever made, full of color. And so I think that was the biggest drive for getting color into printing. And I think it was a big drive.
Would you speak at all about the beginning of your interest in this entire world?
Why should I do that? That's about me and not the pictures, Alan. Why do you want me to talk about me?
That was a simple question.
Shall I tell you the origins of my interest in this? Yes, I will. My father had a printing press in the basement, and we printed illicit passes to the naval base so we could watch movies for nothing. And there was a big red C in the middle of the blue pass with black type, so we had to figure out how to register. I was 10, and I figured out how to fit 2 colors in a relief print.
That was easy.
It was easy. It's true. It's true. What was your second question?
How did you proceed independently on your own to obtain all this information? Was there any...
Alan Chasanoff, I don't like the direction of these questions. can't I talk about the pictures?
The first one was a simple answer. Maybe you have another simple answer finally.
I had to get a living when I got married, and my wife and I moved to Meriden, Connecticut, and I got a job in a printing company. And it rapidly became clear that you couldn't make a print without knowing how to photograph. And then I realized you couldn't photograph if you knew how to make a print. And I didn't have anybody to teach me, and I got books and I read about all the old processes and I tried them.
So you went back to books and
Yeah,
in
books.
the library, where did you
Yeah.
go to get the books?
I don't know, I just found them in junk shops.
Independently?
Yeah.
And then put it all
Yeah,
together?
Photographic Facts and Formulas, Jordan and Wall, that's the great one. Can we move on?
Yes.
All right, now I want a very short break. I want to move into the beginning of photography, and we have to move around the corner to do that. Is that all right? Just a very quick, short, not a long break. Okay, now the light stinks in here. Does everybody know why the light stinks in here?
Because the Fox Talbot.
Yeah, it stinks because there's two Fox Talbots here. They don't want them to fade, right? So photography was really absolutely astonishing because it was invented by about 4 or 5 different people. It's absolutely incredible the way it happened. And the two people we remember are Daguerre and Fox Talbot. Daguerre, the elegant Frenchman, Fox Talbot, the filthy rich Englishman. Daguerre figured out a system for making pictures on metal. Fox Talbot figured out a system for making them on paper. Really, I've always thought that there were 5 fundamental people in the invention of photography. There was Niepce, a Frenchman who in 1826 made the first real permanent photograph. There was Daguerre, who partnered with Niepce and figured out a completely different process of making them on silver-plated copper, which I'll talk about in a minute. There was Fox Talbot, who figured out a way to make them on paper, make paper negatives and then paper prints. Then there was Hippolyte Bayard, whom I always put right in the beginning because he was the most elegant and wonderful photographer of all of them. And he invented an autopositive system, a system where paper was pre-exposed, and upon exposure through the camera, it became a positive. And then there was Sir John Herschel. You must enjoy this. I think he's one of the inventors. Fox Talbot couldn't figure out how to fix his pictures. He would make these pictures and then they would darken or fade away. And he wrote a letter, I believe, you can maybe correct me. I think he wrote a letter to Herschel, and Herschel wrote back and said, try hyposulfite of soda. And Herschel figured out hypo from South Africa, really. And one of the great early pictures we have is the Julia Margaret Cameron portrait of Sir John Herschel, which is right there in 1860 or something, he made it. But let's talk about the technology happening right in the beginning. The first process of real note was the daguerreotype. Now, I should say something about Niepce's process first. Niepce figured out how to coat a plate with something he called, I think, bitumen of Judea. I think that's what he called it. Actually, it was asphaltum. And he figured out that if you exposed it through a lens for 8 hours, it hardened. And you could then put it in a solvent if you were very, very careful and wash away the stuff that wasn't hardened. And there still is a picture in the collection at Texas that he made, and the picture was an 8-hour exposure, so the shadows are in one place in the beginning of the picture and another at the end. But it was a complete dead end. It didn't go anywhere. But it's interesting because it's the technology by which all printing plates were etched once photography and printing combined. It's very interesting. The photogravure is based upon bitumen of Judea on a copper plate as the etching mechanism. So here Niepce, trying to make photographs with it, stumbled on the system by which we make printing plates, which is really interesting. Daguerre did something completely different. And I have to say, we don't know how much Niepce had to do with this process. But the thing Daguerre figured out, we'll give him credit right now, was that you could get a polished piece of copper, you could silver plate it, which was something relatively easy to do, so you had a shiny mirrored surface. You could sensitize it with a salt and then an iodide and have silver iodide on the surface, which is light sensitive. You could expose it in a camera. Nothing visible would happen, but you then could expose that exposed plate to the fumes of mercury, and mercury vapor would precipitate out on the surface of the silver-plated copper where it had been exposed. This is completely crazy. And who knows how we ever figured it out. But once the mercury deposit was on there, you could rinse it with a salt, later with hypo, Herschel's hypo, and you could make the picture permanent. But the daguerreotype is very, very interesting for a bunch of reasons. First of all, it's on a piece of metal, and all the destructive chemistry could be washed away when the thing was fixed and washed. So the daguerreotype is in effect totally permanent. If it's not protected from air, it will tarnish and turn black. So anytime you have a daguerreotype in a case, if you pull it out of the case, you'll find that it has paper glued all around it to seal it from the air. And when you see daguerreotypes with color distortion around the edge of the mouth, that's because that air seal has been broken. The second thing about the daguerreotype that's interesting is that it's an autopositive process. The thing put in the camera makes the positive. If light strikes a silver salt, the silver salt becomes dark, so the light stuff in the world is made dark, so the tones are reversed. So we get a negative. We don't get a positive in one step. Daguerre's process is fascinating because the mercury stuck to where the light had exposed the plate. And then because the plate was a mirror, the mercury was white, and if we reflected the plate against a dark ground, we saw a positive. It's very, very interesting. That's one reason why the cases have a dark lining. If you open a daguerreotype part way and you look at the reflection of the case in the mirror, it turns into a beautiful, strong positive. So bear in mind that the daguerreotype is autopositive with the mirror having to reflect blackness in order to make the picture show up. The next thing about the daguerreotype was that it was unique, and you only got one.